I walked down that aisle knowing I was buying time. My mother's sighs, my brother's debts, the way our house had begun to whisper its own shame. The chapel smelled of beeswax and lilies, silk pooled along marble like softened light. Guests sat like statues carved from expectation. I had rehearsed how to look steady, how to let the world see me as the man who would repair a family's future with a ring and an address. I had not rehearsed feeling my throat close each time she moved. She stood beneath the arch like something made of weather, a presence that rearranged air around it. People leaned forward as if to hear a magnet hum. Even candles seemed to angle their flames toward her. Up close, she was an impossible geometry of calm. Hair braided with threads of silver that never gathered at her temples. Skin that took light and held it instead of scattering it. Her hands were still as if sleep had never found them. When she smiled, the hush in the room deepened. Not out of reverence, but because the sound of her expression consumed the need to speak. We had both agreed to this in precise adult sentences. My voice had been steady in the room where the papers were signed, hers colder, not unkind but efficient. There was no romance in the calculus, only ledgers and positions, the way names on one page would close the gap between shame and standing for my family. My mother had looked at me with a gratitude that tasted like relief. I had swallowed it. I had not expected my hands to remember how to tremble at beauty. At the foot of the altar she reached for my sleeve with a touch that felt like a command and a benediction all at once. The first time her fingers curled around me, I thought of anchors and of the way ships settle when storms pass. They were cool, not chilling. The air slipped against my skin, as if the world itself bent to the margin where she touched. I told myself the sensation came from my imagination, from nerves. Later, when she laughed in a way that bent the acoustics of the room, a dozen glasses chimed in sympathy, as if tuned by an invisible hand. I had decided there was my stubborn, humiliating pride, instead of leaving my family to drown. I had chosen to step into a bargain. The terms were polite, the penalties clear. Public appearances, a name that would open doors, a dowry sufficient to erase a ledger's last stain. I told myself that choice made me honorable. In quiet moments, however, I noticed the small things that unsettled me. The way reflections of her in polished wood looked delayed by a breath. The way night seemed to sharpen to a deeper black where she walked, as though shadow itself stepped aside. If you like impossible romances, stay with me. We met formally at an evening meant to feel accidental. A garden party on the edge of town, where arranged introductions wore the guise of serendipity. She had been there before the rest of us, standing among clipped hedges with a glass of water held in a hand that did not tremble. Conversation stuttered into silence when she appeared. It was not that she demanded attention, but that she rearranged the attention already present. People resumed their dialogue as if nothing had happened, but when they later told the story, they always mentioned the moment the air shifted. The arrangement was straightforward. My cousin spoke for my father. A solicitor carried the ledger and did not pretend it was poetry when he read the numbers. There was an urgency to it. A creditor who measured kindness in calendars, a mortgage that no sermon could dissolve. The proposition that was offered to me was not malicious. It was a solution dressed in silk and silvered promises. The woman who would become my wife offered stability. My family accepted it with expressions stitched from relief. I will not pretend I went into the bargain as a martyr. I am neither noble nor blind, I calculated. I thought of my mother's hands, of the broken stare that caught against my sister's ankle, of the small humiliations that accumulate into a life. I thought of how easy it would be to erase that ledger with one elegant signature. I thought of what I might lose if I refused. To say I was coerced would be false. To say I was entirely free would be a worse lie. My choice was pressed by a world that values names and numbers. I leaned into that pressure and sealed the agreement with my signature and a soft, private prayer that I would not wake one morning and find I had married merely a fix, a name. Our courtship, if one can call what followed by that polite term, was measured in observances. There were rehearsals at the estate, dinners where the band learned how to shape itself to her presence, photographers who learned the exact angle that softened the light on her cheek. She moved like a thing practiced to be adored. Precise gestures, a steady carriage of chin, an unerring patience for other people's conversation. At night she read books that had not been published for decades, tracing pages with fingers that left no oils, as if curiosity shone on her like a warmth she had not known how to hold. People adored her because to adore her was easy. She returned their adoration with the sort of meticulous consideration that makes a person seem charitable. When a child dropped a toy at her feet, she paused and picked it up with a reverence that felt preordained. When a stranger stumbled at a step, she reached to steady them with the same calm efficiency, her fingers as precise as any practiced surgeon. It was impossible at first to disentangle admiration from fear. That comes later when you learn to listen to the silences that live in a room. She asked me to read to her once, on a rainy afternoon when the estate seemed to exhale in sympathy with the weather. I had feared reading aloud. My voice in front of an audience felt like a too small suit. But when I opened a book, she leaned toward me with a concentration that made the words into something alive. She asked questions that were crookedly modern, about the weight of decisions, about whether men could truly atone with a signature, and I answered with the clumsy honesty someone uses when the stakes suddenly feel human. She recorded my words with a stillness that made them seem important, and for the first time I noticed a small, dangerous tilt in the way I felt toward her. Not fascination alone, but a wanting to be seen, to matter in the architecture of her attention. There were gifts, not ostentatious things, no chests of jewels or sculptures, but smaller attentions that carried an intimacy that was hard to place. A jacket left at the side of a chair for me to find, a cup of tea arranged with the exact temperature I preferred, a light placed at the hallway that made the path to my office less stark. She learned the rhythm of our household not by asking but by observing. Her changes were careful corrections, not impositions. In these domestic gestures, slow and patient, the edges between duty and desire blurred. On the morning of the wedding, the wind carried a cold with it that seemed older than weather. I recall the texture of the aisle, silk under palm, a scent of lilies so thick the room felt like a pressed flower, and my own hands which found the velvet of the pews as if to anchor myself. The ceremony moved with the ordained calm of things that are inevitable. Rings were exchanged, vows recited in the language of contracts softened by sentiment. When our hands brushed over the velvet, the contact felt like a disclosure. We exchanged a line before the vows were finished. She leaned in, so close her hair whispered against my ear, and in a voice that had been leveled to the same polite register as everything else she asked, "Do you understand the cost?" I can still feel the shape of that sentence. It was neither burden nor plea, it was an assessment. In the hush I felt the weight of what I had already known and had still rationalized away. I answered with the kind of bravery that is a deliberate performance. "I do." She placed her palm on the small of my back as the choir rose, a stabilizing hand. The world, for a moment, held only the breath between us. The priest spoke words about love and obligation, as if the two were not often tangled in the same rope. The first kiss, the ceremonial one, planted before a room of watchers, was delicate and measured. People applauded politely. They saw a perfect union, a handsome man, a flawless bride, a table and a contract. After the applause, when the world unfurled back into a practical hum, she gripped my hand in the car with an intensity that made me think of unspoken vows. She had learned, in the hour between ceremony and reception, the way to make a private gesture feel like a sovereign act. "Come," she said simply, and I followed, because at that point I had promised not only my name, but a life. At home, the estate revealed itself to be a theater whose stage we would repopulate. There were rooms meant for entertaining that were too vast for daily life, and smaller ones that held secret light. In the days that followed the wedding, the public translated itself into private practice. Dinners for acquaintances became breakfasts for two, speeches became the clink of cutlery. What surprised me was how easily she adapted to the small mercies of ordinary days. The way she fed the cat with the same attentiveness she had once given to conversations of state. The way she sat by my desk while I sorted the bills, silent and observant, but not intrusive. Quiet, I learned, can be a kind of teaching. At night she would walk the corridors and stand at the window, watching the city like someone reading a map she had not yet learned by heart. Her shoulders, when the evening cooled, showed the smallest tension, an almost imperceptible coil that relaxed when she thought herself unobserved. She started to keep watch when I could not sleep. I would wake and find her in the study, hands folded, eyes empty of the usual amusement, Once, when a storm took the lights, she came to my bed and traced the contour of the window frame with a finger, as if cataloging the room for some future map. Her presence there was not possessive. It was watchful in a way that translated into a protection that felt wholly unlike the transactional posture we had used to begin. There were also moments when she surprised me with tenderness that felt unprogrammed. After returning from a charity function where an old woman had sobbed into her hand, she came home and sat with me until my mouth found a laugh I had not felt in months. She learned my little habits, how I drank my coffee, how I tapped the table when thinking, and began, unrequested, to accommodate them with a curiosity that was both generous and disarming. Little by little, the architecture of our life rearranged itself to allow for a tenderness that demanded response. 1. We began to share stories in the way people discover secret channels of feeling. She wanted to know how our family had come to be as it was. I asked about the faint echoes in her voice I could not place. Her answers were often elliptical. "I have been long enough to see patterns repeat," she said once, fingers tracing the rim of a glass. "I do not collect memories the way you do. I gather moments to understand intent." When I asked what she meant, she would tilt her head as if the concept were simple and say nothing. It was as if she kept rooms in her mind closed, opening only what she chose, and that choice made me feel privileged, and also, secretly, vulnerable. The first night the truth crept toward confession was not cinematic. It came like a song heard through a wall, a quiet admission while washing dishes, hands submerged in hot suds. "I do not age as you do," she said, talking to the sink as if the porcelain were an old friend. "My years are not counted by lines or breath. They are counted by the distance I hold." Her voice might have been making an observation. It landed in me like a pebble in a still pond. It was not an explanation, but a fact, offered without drama. When I asked for more, she closed her eyes and described herself in honest fragments. Time lived like a precise instrument, a safety that meant she neither needed nor expected tenderness, a distance that had been survival. "I know the cost of staying what I am," she whispered. "Loneliness is its own currency." Those were not words asking for sympathy, only making a ledger of what she had already paid. I began to watch for the physical traces that her revelation explained. Sometimes, late at night when the estate slept and the gas lamps in the street guttered out, I would find the sheets of a window pane fogged from her breath, thin as if a human's, then gone like mist. At other times a painting would show its reflection of her with a slight lag, as though the mirror took a softer second to collect her. Once I watched a candle shadow lift slightly toward her as she crossed a room. The world seemed to accept her with different laws surrounding her like a cloak. Despite these differences, the tender acts continued. She set about learning the domestic arts in a way that suggested not obligation, but curiosity. She practiced making soup, standing over the pot like a student of hearthcraft, tracing old recipes with an attentiveness that changed them from obligation into a ritual. We would sit at the small kitchen table and eat from bowls that held warmth in a way the house had not known it could. She started to make small mistakes, the salt a little heavy, the bread slightly underbaked, and I found myself relishing these faults, as if they were proof she was moving into a territory where mistakes mattered, and therefore mattered to me. There was a night when we argued for the first time. Not a storming quarrel, but a collision that left both of us startled. I accused her, clumsily, of remaining distant. She responded without anger, only a quiet sadness. "I was not built to be known," she said. "I was made to be observed." The words were not a defense. They were an outline. After that, she began making subtle confessions. A story about a childhood home whose windows had always faced the wrong sun. A recollection of a river whose surface reflected nothing but sky. Each confession made her seem less like an exhibit, and more like a person shaped by odd experiences. The more she gave of herself, the more I felt my own walls loosening. The city outside continued to assume a neat narrative about us. People praised me for the prudence that had secured my family's fortune. They praised her for being the consummate partner. Invitations came in polite waves. We went to functions and smiled with the practiced accuracy of people whose public faces had been carved to last. But at home, the world rearranged itself in smaller, truer gestures. She would leave little notes on the mantel, single lines of ink about the weather, a reminder to close the study shutters. Her handwriting was angular and precise, and slowly it taught me to look for presence in small objects. One evening, in a stillness that felt like the lead-in to confession, she took my hand and led me out into the garden. The reflecting pool caught the moon in a slice of black glass. The estate's trees stood like watchful sentinels. She moved without ceremony to the edge of the water and sat, letting her reflection duplicate her posture with a patient fidelity. The moon steadied itself in the pool, as if to be part of the conversation. She looked at me in a way that was not practiced. "There is something I must tell you," she said. "It may change everything." There was no melodrama in her voice, only a timbre that made the syllables heavy with the weight of truth. She told me of her options, of how her condition allowed a kind of constancy that could be mistaken for perfection. She told me what it cost to love as an observer, and what it might cost to love as a participant. "To feel completely," she said slowly, "would mean relinquishing what I have been. It would mean I would not return to what I was." Her words were measured and final, a ledger of stakes. I heard the implications. The loss of a status I barely understood but could see in society's reflexive bowing toward her. I heard the fear, too, that she would give up a kind of power, a kind of protection, and trade it for vulnerability. The image settled in me like a new map. She was offered a road without going back. The choice was hers. I wanted to offer a solution that would spare her. I voiced childhood fears that had no bearing on the universe she described. "What if we could find a way?" I began, but she held up a hand, gentle, final. "There is no market for illusions," she said. "This is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a life to be chosen." The firmness of her statement did not feel like a rebuke. It felt like an invitation to let her decide. I told her then, with an odd clarity that surprised me, that I did not want her halved or held back by the weight of my gratitude. "If this is the cost," I said, "do it for yourself." I expected her to protest the bravery of my words. Instead, she surprised me by looking relieved. "I wanted to know you would not ask me to remain aloof for your comfort," she said. "I wanted to know you would not make my sacrifice into your salvation." There was no grand gesture in her acceptance, only the quiet of a person receiving what she had secretly wanted. Permission to choose with eyes wide open. The nights leading up to her decision were patient as any weather. She researched solitude and company with equal seriousness. She would walk to the reflecting pool and stay there until her reflection seemed to soften. Sometimes she took my hand and spoke of things as if reading from the margin of a life. Tastes she might enjoy if she could feel hunger. The small terrors of skin warming and cooling, of losing the careful containment that had been her safeguard. Each thing she named stripped another layer of the old certainty from her being. When the night came, it was not with trumpets or celestial fanfare. It began in the hour when the house holds its breath, in a small chamber whose windows looked out over the garden. She had arranged candles around the reflecting pool. Their flames bent slightly as she walked past, tilting toward her like reeds leaning to listen. The air felt altered, not cold, and not warm. Simply different, as if the house itself had been asked to witness something singular. She knelt at the pool, hands folded over her knees, and with a composure that was the sum of her past and an offering of a future, she spoke the choice aloud. "I will become human," she said, as if checking that the words were mine to hear. "Not to be loved in the way people expect, but to love in the way I have watched others do. To risk being fragile because I believe being fragile may also be true." There was an ache in her voice I had not known existed. It sounded like someone abandoning a tower because the view is no longer enough. "This will mean endings," she warned. "Names I have worn will be gone. There is no returning to what I have been. I will not be as I was." I wanted to argue, to ask if she had considered everything, to beg her not to throw away the safety of constancy. Instead, I found my answer on my own breath. I placed both hands on her shoulders, feeling the smallness of her bones. Things that had looked eternal in daylight now felt thin and human in my hands. And I said, "Then do not do it because of me. Do it because you want to stand beside me without watching." She closed her eyes, and I felt the world pivot, as if hearing a great hinge swing. The transformation did not begin with spectacle. It began with restraint. She inhaled, and for the first time I noticed the tiny fog that formed at the pool's edge. significant in itself because it implied breath, a trait once unremarkable, but now precious. The air around us tensed in sympathy. The reflecting pool showed us both, her with clarity, me with the reflection slightly delayed, as always. Light changed slowly at first, like dawn deciding whether to come. The candle flames leaned not only toward her but around her, forming a circle of warmth that did not touch the skin. There was a sound, too, if a sound can be called that. A low chime, like glass settling in its frame, that seemed to sing from the bones of the estate. The water in the pool, which had mirrored moon and column for years, began to take on a sheen as if another surface were pressing upward beneath it. She rose, and when she moved, the air moved with her, a breath behind a breath. There was a sensation I would later try to name, the world exhaling in recognition. A shimmer, like the edge of heat on a summer road, ran along her arms. Her stillness broke into the smallest of tremors. For a moment, I feared this was too much even for her. Fear for her twofold, of what she was about to lose and of what she might gain. She looked at me then with eyes I had known for months, and in that glance something shifted. Her gaze softened in a way that had not belonged to her before. "I cannot promise I will not falter," she said, voice breaking. "But I want to try." I took her hands in mine. Where they had once felt immaculate and practiced, now there was a faint flutter, like a trapped bird loosening a wing. Her pulse was not something I had thought to find. Now the beat was there under my fingers, awkward and startling. Quick at first, like a child's, then settling. She breathed again, and the breath sounded human, an imperfect rise and fall that was poetry in its insistence. Then the pool answered. The surface that had reflected the moon rippled though the air around was still. From the depths a light rose, pale and cool. It wrapped her legs like a ribbon and moved up in slow twists, a substance of luminescence that did not burn but warmed like the first day of spring. The candles, the leaves, the house itself seemed to lean into the light. I smelled scent then, something like rain on limestone and the memory of pine, an aroma that had no name I could anchor in any dictionary. Pain came like a tide. She gasped, and I felt every breath of her as if it were my own. She cried out once, not in the way of someone hurt by violence, but in the quiet, ragged sound of someone who discovers old habits of stillness breaking. Her skin warmed beneath my palms until it felt like the surface of a well-lived cup. She shivered not from cold, but from the shock of living being instantiated. Tears tracked down her cheeks, and for a moment, just that, the old, distant composure slipped away. She looked older and younger at once. Age, for a breath, was a language we were both learning to read. As the light ebbed, the world drew itself back together. The shimmer receded into something that could be mistaken for a memory by those who found it later and could not place why the curtains trembled. Her breathing steadied. When she finally opened her eyes, the reflection in the pool matched the present for the first time. She blinked, and there was a small pinkness to the rims of her eyes, an ordinary human detail I had never expected to crave. We did not speak for a long time. Words felt like accessories to the scene we had just witnessed. I cupped her face and felt the table of her cheekbones, the heat of her skin that had at last taken on the cire's soft trademark of mortality. Her fingers found the nape of my neck with a clumsy gratitude, and I felt, in that touch, the sanctity of something she had chosen. When she took my hands and said, in a voice that trembled with newly vulnerable feeling, "I am yours in the way I can finally remember to be." The admission was a vow without ceremony. There was no chorus from the heavens, no dramatic signatures. The neighbor's owl somewhere in the hedgerow called out as if approving, and the candles stilled. For days afterward, the house smelled of the pool and of wet earth, and we learned the meaning of small things. How to heat water to the right temperature for tea, how to iron a collar without burning it, how to fold sheets so they felt like a shelter and not a stage. There were costs, immediate and inevitable. She woke one morning with a cold that settled in her chest, a reminder that immunity had been a shield now willingly put aside. Her skin bruised in places where once it would have recoiled like steel. She laughed at her own clumsiness with utensils, which made me laugh too, because the sound of it felt like a bell that had finally been rung. There were teeth to be seen to, and patience to be learned for small aches. She held these things with a dignity that was not proud, but brave. And the bravery was older and truer than any public accolade ever was. People outside our walls continued to see the same couple and assume the same manners. Invitations arrived, and in the eyes of gossipmongers we were still the perfect pair. My prudent name and her flawless composure. No one suspected the late-night arguments about borrowing a sweater, or the way we bickered about whether the curtains should be tied back. They did not see the small and very human things that knit us together. The mug left unwashed because one of us needed sleep. The text sent just to say, "I'm thinking of you." The way we sometimes fell asleep reading on the couch, the book drooping on our chests. Sometimes when the world felt too large and its expectations too heavy, we would return to the garden and sit by the pool which now reflected not only moonlight, but 100 small domestic moments reflected in the surface like fish. We would talk, often in fragments, about what it meant to be mortal. She wanted to know what it felt like to want something impossibly and to be denied. "Does it hurt?" she asked once softly. "To feel hunger? To ache with want?" "Sometimes," I said. "But other times the want is a compass. It tells you what to seek. It makes the finding brighter." She smiled, small and a little embarrassed, then leaned her head against my shoulder. In that contact she trusted me with a fragile thing. Her newness. There was a humility to it that made me understand, in a way no contract ever could, the extent of her sacrifice. Our intimacy deepened not through dramatic confessions, but through the mundane tyranny of shared life. We made mistakes. We learned to apologize, to ask for space without building a prison of resentment. She did not become sentimental, nor did she lose the cool that had first complicated my attraction. She retained a clarity that sometimes cut like glass, but now it was tempered by a softness that came from having to care as if for a wound. I thought, early and with a selfish pride I admit now, that I had saved my family by this arrangement. But what I had not counted on was how much I would be saved by her decision. She returned my world to me by choosing to be present in it in the only way that matters, with the possibility of absence. The knowledge that she could vanish back into what she had been, but chose not to, made every ordinary moment a bright coin. I felt compelled to be better, not by ledger-bound obligation, but because someone had made herself fragile for me. There were nights she would wake and stare at the ceiling, fingers worrying the soft fabric of the blanket. "I think fear," she said once, whispering into the dark. "Fear is a companion I did not know I could hold." I learned then to cradle her quiet anxieties without turning them into diagnoses. She had become human enough to be frightened and human enough to confide, and that trust became a new covenant between us. No contracts, only mutual care. We adjusted to the world differently now. The estate still required the politeness of public roles. Our names still opened doors. But inside our walls we practiced imperfection as piety. We spent Sundays learning a clumsy tenderness, cooking badly and laughing through it, teaching each other how to fold a fitted sheet without profanity, sharing stories about the banal cruelties of daily life. She taught me to slow down and pay attention to small details. I taught her that it was acceptable to be less than poised. Time, which had once seemed a foreign policy she did not have to manage, now became an intimate ledger. Small victories and small losses, each one accounted for with a gratitude that felt almost holy. She aged, as is the human punishment. But in that aging, there was also accumulation. Not the cold accumulation of trophies, but the soft stock of memory and mistake and affection. Her hair, which had been threaded with silver, now took on a warm gray that caught the light. Lines learned their place around her mouth. She laughed at these changes, and sometimes felt nostalgia for the distance she had known. But she said, every time with the same steady conviction, that she would not trade this life. We built a life that felt like a language, a grammar of smallness. Love became not the peak of some narrative, but the architecture of daily attention. We argued, we reconciled. We learned the artful patience of being subject to one another's moods. Once, when rain came sudden and hard, she sat at my bedside and described the sensation of fingers pressed against the glass. "It is loud," she said, smiling, "but now I can hear it like everyone else." I held her then, and felt the fragile rhythm of her heart under my palm. There was no grandeur in that gesture, only an unspectacular tenderness that felt, strangely, like nobility. Sometimes, in the quiet hours, I would be struck by the audacity of the whole thing. I had married, under a social calculus, a woman who at first had been more sculpture than person. She had become what she chose to be, relinquishing arcane advantages and taking up the vulnerabilities of flesh. She had traded something of the infinite for the finite, and in that exchange we both found, if I dare be sentimental, a kind of equality I had not thought possible. Her sacrifice had not been given to save me. It had been given so she could stand beside me, not above or apart, but utterly with me. Once, after a long winter, we walked through the city market and tasted bread still warm from the oven. She closed her eyes and let the smell take her like a revelation. "This," she said, smiling with a softness I still find sacred, "is better than the rare delicacies I once chose for ceremony." She meant it as praise for the ordinary joy of being human. I felt a warmth at the ribs then, the sort of contentment that arrives after long, hard labor, a steady, honest satisfaction. The world continued to call her perfect, if people thought about her at all, because perfection is what the public is good at soothing itself with. Those who had once watched her with polite reverence continued to do so. They did not, for the most part, notice how she flinched if someone raised a hand quickly, or how she learned to laugh at jokes that were not clever, or how she collected mismatched socks in a drawer and considered them treasures. The public face remained flawless. The private life, however, was a messy, miraculous thing we tended daily. I will not pretend that everything was idyllic. Her choice meant she would one day grow frail in ways she had never imagined, and sometimes that truth sat between us like a small, insistent fog. I would wake in the night imagining the sound of a visit to a doctor, the dry rustle of forms, the sterile scent of waiting rooms, and my chest would tighten. We talked about those things in the practical language of two people who had planned much, but not eternity. "I am mortal," she said once, to ground the conversation in reality. "I will get sick. I will grow old. I will die. But now I know what love asks of me, and the asking is what I choose." She kept her old habits sometimes, as if honoring a past life. She would polish silver at odd hours, set books in precise order, and sometimes step into a room and act like an observer because old habits die slowly. Each of those moments was a reminder of the contract we had deconstructed, who we had once been versus who we were becoming. I learned to accept that the past is a language one can reference without being bound by it. There came a day when my mother, now older and more fragile, sat in our kitchen and held my wife's hand as if to measure the solidity of the world. "You have done something brave," my mother said, her voice rough with gratitude. "You have not only saved us, you have returned yourself to us with a humanity I did not think you had the right to ask for." The words made my wife blush, a flush I still delight in, and she squeezed my mother's fingers as if making a promise. We have, in the years since, made a life that is not the tidy resolution of a novel, but the continuing work of two people learning to be soft with each other. We have argued and forgiven and offered small, humiliating apologies for things that mattered only within the small, elemental logic of our days. We have visited places I once avoided, and now we walk through them hand in hand. Not out of show, but because we want to. Sometimes I think back to the aisle, to the precise geometry of silk and marble, and the ledger that first made me bow my head to a bargain. I remember the sensation of her hand on my sleeve, and the air making itself consecrated around her body. I think of the way I trembled with the terrible simple knowledge that I was not only buying a house or a name, but opening my life to an unknown that would, in time, teach me what love could be. She is no longer the perfect woman the world first praised. She stumbles over curbs and forgets names, and sometimes she cries at the wrong parts of movies and laughs at jokes she does not quite understand. She keeps the garden poorly, and yet somehow the roses flourish. She has traded the armor of observation for the risk of feeling, and in that exchange she has become infinitely more. She is flawed, human, and terrifyingly herself. I married a woman who seemed perfect because the world needed a symbol, and in doing so I found a person. She was not human at the beginning of our story, not in the way I understood humanity. And in choosing to become human, she gave us both a gift that meddled with the very furniture of our lives. What she gave up was not small: constancy, a kind of invulnerability, an old and solitary crown. What she gained was the exquisite, dangerous thing of being present and chosen. If this story speaks to the corner of your heart that loves the strange and tender, perhaps you will follow for more.